Now we're talking about Christian Buck's Eunoia. Max, let's see that book. Can you tell us how it's organized?
Yeah, there's five main chapters, one corresponding to each vowel.
Excepting Y.
A, E, I, O, U, excepting Y, but he does have a chapter for Y words at the end. He has a little bit of an appendix.
Kind of a nod to Y, yeah. So in chapter E, which is the one we're reading, what does he do? What's his limit?
He can only use words with E as the vowel. Mm-hmm. No other vowels are permitted.
Okay. Will you flip a few pages into the chapter and read 2 sentences randomly chosen?
Sure. Then the sled gets sent wherever the nemesis dwell. There the Greek pretenders pretend. The well-hewn steed represents the perfect present.
Thank you, Max. Well, anybody want to comment on what that sounds like? Emily?
It sounds sort of astoundingly like normal, unconstrained language.
It really does? Okay, can anyone hear the constraint? Allie?
Yeah, I actually think that when you were reading Max, I kind of thought about the difference that you get, just kind of the visceral difference between reading it and hearing it. And hearing it, I think it's easier to actually kind of cancel out the semantic meaning, just because it does sound so
How interesting
melodic.
we've gotten to that point, because this text, the reason why it's important that Emily said what she said is that this text tells a story. It tells the story of Helen of Troy. It really tells the story. These sentences are not fragments. They're not paratactic. They're narrative. They work in order. The only constraint is that it's only E, and there's some other constraints we'll talk about. So this isn't language poetry. Is it rebelling from language poetry? Maybe, but it sort of underlies the difference between chapters 9.1 and 9.3. And what do you think the main difference is, Max?
Well, here he's focusing more on sound, which maybe the language poets weren't doing entirely.
Well, I'm not so sure that's the way I would say it. Where is the experimentalism in language poetry? At what level does it take place?
Well, we looked at a lot of works where it took place on the level of the sentence.
It takes place in the level of the writing, at the writing.
Sure.
Where does the experiment take place in soliloquy and Eunoia?
Well, right, here it's more, I guess, conceptual.
It's at the level of the concept.
The term we're going toward, yeah.
And then the rest of it is working out. So the one constraint is, it's called a lipogram. It's actually a special version of lipogram. It's a univocal lipogram. A lipogram involves having to eliminate a letter. In this case, he eliminates all of the vowels except for one in every case, in the case of every chapter. But there's some other limits. Each chapter has to contain a voyage. Each chapter has to contain a banquet. Each chapter has to contain an orgy. Each chapter must allude to the art of writing, and 98% of the words available must be used. Wow. So
Do we know how he arrived at 98%?
I think he looked at all the potential words that only have the vowel he needs in it, and he decided, I'm going to try to go all the way, and there's only a couple of words that he doesn't use. What's a word we use to describe this feat, this writing feat, this artistic feat?
genius.
Genius? Virtuosity, I think. Let me read the passage toward the beginning, which is fulfilling his requirement of referring to the art of writing, and you can comment on it. Here we go. Unfettered, these sentences repress free speech. The text deletes selected letters. The revered exegete, the exegete would be, who's an exegete? What's an exegete?
Someone who does exegesis.
And exegesis is an interpretation, historically an interpreter of the Bible, but more generally an interpreter. And he's an interpreter rather than a writer. The revered exegete rejected metered verse. Well, we know that. He rebels. He sets new precedents. He lets cleverness exceed decent levels. He eschews esteemed genres. We sneer when we detect the clever scheme. We jeer. We jest. We express resentment. We detest these depthless pretenses. We prefer genteel speech where sense redeems senselessness. Okay, interpret any part of that. Go. Amaris.
I think what was interesting, because I saw him perform this, and I was able to then immerse myself more in the musical or whatever quality of it. And what I noted, interestingly enough, and I think Christian Book comments on it as well, is that each vowel seems to have its own sensibility and attitude. So here we see those words like resentment and pretentiousness come out. And in you is the most memorable to me. It seems sort of lewd and irreverent in its own way.
Ooh. And
So-
O is open and
Yeah.
rounded. There's a psycholinguistics involved with vowels. There's no doubt that this is creating that. Allie, what else would you say about that meta-writing passage?
I mean, it kind of just seems like the platform of ModPo to me. Like,
Platform of ModPo, meaning the whole thing.
it's very modern poetry. I mean, you know.
But there's something special. I don't mean to cut you off. You said something really profound, but I want to jump right on it and do something else. Notice that at the end he says, we prefer genteel speech, where sense redeems senselessness. This is not language poetry. This is not the fragment.
But I couldn't tell if that sentence was ironic.
Let's
and I kind of
suppose
read
for a
it as
second that
ironic.
it's not ironic. Because this has I get the story of Helen.
Maybe it's the fact that he's
Helen of
able to
Troy.
write incomplete sentences with this.
Was able to. I think he intended to.
Exactly.
He intended to tell a normal narrative story with this severe limitation at the level of the concept. Sense redeems senselessness. Now, that's not universally true of the work of the great Christian Buck. He's very into sound poetry, which is all sound sense rather than semantic sense. But in this case, sense redeems senselessness. It's not clear how ironic that is, but there's definitely something going on. Let me just ask you for your comments on what the experience is like of encountering this remarkable text. Who wants to go first? Dave?
My experience was similar to Amaris in that each letter, when I skimmed them, had a much different feel, especially E, and especially during the battle scene at the end, a lot of sharp sounds that really seemed to mimic the battle that was taking place.
So he's really thinking about sounds.
It's really vivid.
Yeah, okay. Molly, what did you think encountering this?
I was surprised that I didn't really notice the constraint at first. I mean, it really felt so natural and so well put together that it was kind of shocking.
Okay, Max?
It really is kind of awe-inspiring, I think.
7 years to do this. 7 years. What does that make you think? What can you imagine? What do you imagine him doing for 7 years?
I imagine him generating this whole vocabulary and then bit by bit going through it, seeing what kind of sentences he can make, seeing what kind of story he can tell, what sort of characters emerge out of the words that he has.
It's remarkable. What does Eunoia mean? Anybody know what the word Eunoia means?
Like true sound. U is true in Greek, isn't it?
It's the shortest word in the English language to use all the vowels except for Y, and it means beautiful thinking. It was used by Aristotle to describe a state of mind that you need to be in order to make a friend. Eunoia.
Oh, wow.
Let me quote what Christian Buck has said about this work and ask one or two of you to comment, and then we'll wrap up. He writes that the text makes a Sisyphean spectacle of its labor, willfully crippling its language in order to show that even under such improbable conditions of duress, language can still express an uncanny, if not sublime thought. That's great. Emily?
Yeah, I to put it sort of indelicately, I feel like a lot of the poets we read have been sort of beating the language is dead, language doesn't work horse. And it's nice to finally have someone say, look, it still works. Even crippled and sort of purposefully hindered, it is still a very capable system.
It's essentially optimistic about language, I think is what
Very
you're
optimistic,
saying. Yeah, language will survive. Even if pushed to its brink, we will be able to tell the story of Helen of Troy. That story that was told orally for a long time before it ever got written down. One of the most essential stories. All right, who wants the final word on this? Amaris, what do you feel about encountering this? I think I may have already asked you this, but I want to hear it again.
I mean, contrary to Emily's, I was more drawn in by the sound qualities of it. So my appreciation despite the fact that when Max read it, it had that sort of monotonous quality to it, and I was like, oh wait, I want all the vowels in there. Sorry, Max. But Christian book really makes it come to life, and it's it's the genius of I think his composition and his performance.
I think no matter how, we're not going to attempt to bridge the difference between the two of you. It's a kind of an impossible thing. It would be a gap in your friendship. Maybe you need some Eunoia, a little bit of Eunoia. But I just want to say that one of the things that unites you, the two of you, in thinking of, in praising this work, is to ponder that 7 years of effort. That this is no anything goes, And I think that's true, despite what Emily said, of most of the poets that we've encountered. These are really, really virtuosic efforts. This is sort of an extreme Sisyphean version of it, but virtuosity is the rule of this particular part of our chapter.